So for the past, day and a half, we've been talking about generational similarities, differences, stereotypes. Is ageism felt by everybody, somebody, men, women? And with this next to last panel, we actually are going to call the question, do the generations get along? Do they or don't they? Is the concept of generational warfare real? Imagined? Somewhere in between? So I'm going to quickly introduce my panelists because they're here both because of their professional experiences, but also their sort of lived experiences. And we're going to have a conversation about, is it real? Is it not? And I'd also want to open this up to the audience to sort of comment whether they think this idea of generational warfare, whether it's in politics, in policy, in the workforce, at home, is real or imagined. So I'm directionally dyslexic, so going my left to the end. I want to introduce Chris Moschner, who's the Chief Marketing Officer for Finance of America. And Chris found himself with a 20-year career that is focused on products and services that specifically serve aging consumers. And I asked him if that was by plan, and he said no.
Yeah, I'm a glutton for punishment. I've done adult underwear, annuities, and reverse mortgages. So it's, this wasn't my life's work, but I've loved it every step of the way.
And Chris is on the panel because with the work that he's doing at Finance America Reverse and the use of, no, it's just Finance of America now, really has sort of using the house not only as a retirement asset, but it's also led to some interesting conversations among family members. So we'll touch on that in a few minutes. And then next to Chris is Charlotte Japp Crater, who I love this, thinker, super connector, and entrepreneur in the aging tech space. And I think you just turned 30?
No, I'm 34.
Oh, okay. Charlotte founded an age tech startup called Circle, which was connecting older and younger professionals for personal and professional growth. She has since moved on to the venture capital world and is now working as a business development professional for Cooley, LOP. And then next to Charlotte is Serena Bian, who has a really, really interesting background. She actually just finished up as a senior advisor, design and innovation for the US Surgeon General, focusing on what was a key headline for the Surgeon General, the crisis of loneliness. What I also love is that she is a Zen chaplain in training. And her area of interest, professional interest, is pursuing intergenerational development for social movements. So before I kick it off with this panelist, though, I'm going to put Laura Carstensen on the spot because we have talked a lot, and even over the last day or so, about these generational stereotypes and ageism. And anyhow, we were off to the side about an hour ago where I'm like, we need to have you say this. So,
it's been super interesting to listen to the discussion on all the panels in the last day or so about ageism. And also the critiques that have come about ageism. Is it ageism? Is there youngism? And there is a literature on youngism, and that's certainly well documented too. Is it ageist, though, to be discriminating against young? And are these generational effects? Or Camille made the good point, maybe it's life stages we should be talking about. And I wanted to just say, I think these are really different concepts. Generation, cohort, youngism, and ageism are different, and they're qualitatively different. It's not just they're directed in different ways. Generations, researchers and the Pew effort and so on are just discarding them because they're sloppy, because you can have be 20 years apart in the same generation, right? So it's a messy, muddy thing, and people make up stereotypes about them, but it doesn't mean much. Cohort is something that's much more precise. We're usually talking about 10-year cohorts. Were you born from between 1900 and 1910? Those are big effects. People who are old today are 10 years younger than cohorts that were born 20 years earlier. I mean, big differences. It's their education effects. so I guess all I wanted to be clear about is that we should be clear what we're talking about, because they're not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. They very likely interact. Life stage and age. You could be having a startup, but if you're 70 and you have a startup, is there ageism against you at that startup, even though you share more with a 40-year-old person with starting a company? So it's all, I guess what I'm asking all of us to do is to think about how those things are different. And then when we're talking about them, to be clear which of those things we're talking about. I'm going to stop in just a second, Martha. The importance of this hit me yesterday when Sasha had said young people who are very anti gender discrimination, anti-racial discrimination are pretty ageist. And the first thing I thought is, I think they're talking about a cohort. Is younger people who care a lot about equity and then look at an older generation that's largely white, largely conservative relative to younger generations. They're saying, oh, those people, and they might label it age, but I think it's about cohort. When people are discriminating against young people, it's often labeling a cohort that they're a member of. Lazy, not interested, won't read. These are cohort effects. I don't think most of those mean that we think young people can't do something. And with older people, it's often very much about capacity. Can a person do something? I'm going to stop. All I say is, and the point I'm trying to make, not very articulately or concisely, is they're different, and we should be clear which ones we're talking about.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot. All right, so for this conversation, what I think I would like us to talk about really is that older generation taking something away from me. And as I said, you hear it, talking about the future of Social Security. It's those damn boomers who won't, die quickly enough, and therefore the younger generations aren't going to get what they thought they were promised. We certainly hear about it in the workforce. Younger employees are not being promoted as fast because those older employees aren't retiring. And we hear it in politics, just with the recent election, sort of this polarization that we see, and more younger people saying, you know what, I want mine, and I think I'm voting for him. So I'm just going to throw it out to all of you. Is generational warfare truth, fiction, somewhat nuanced? What have we experienced personally? Own opinion, professionally? Chris, can I start with you?
Yeah, I can start. Warfare feels like a bit of a strong term to me. Is there friction there? Absolutely. I perceive that generations are a function of obviously the when and the where. Geography plays, but also when you grew up. Clearly, what economic environment did you grow up? Were you in a good economic time? Was there a recession? Was there a crisis? What political environment did you grow up in? What geopolitical? Was it war or peacetime? What technology did you have? Clearly, the role of social media, we would say, is influencing younger generation. So I think all those things clearly play, but I still believe that there's still more similarities in terms of core beliefs about what you want out of your life, love of children and family, aspirations for the future. And I think those things are still there, but tension is certainly there. And you mentioned some of them. And I think in my world in housing, in the reverse mortgage business, I have a front row seat to both the good and the downside of housing. And the older generation, baby boomer plus, have demonstrably 70, 80% of the home equity out there, right? So there's now $14 trillion with a T of home equity available to people over 60. And there's not even 1/100th of that available to people under 30. And I think the younger generations perceive they're being priced out of that benefit, and they won't have that asset later in life. Now, is it the fault of the generation? We could argue that for hours, but I do believe housing is an area of friction, because the reality, what I can tell you, 30 years from now, regardless, homes and the land they're built on will be an asset. And if it's the person who's living in the home doesn't own it, somebody will. And if it's not the person living in the home, it might likely be a large multinational or investment fund like a Blackstone or a BlackRock. And that has big implications for wealth transfer and longevity and using that asset for retirement.
I think that's an important point. It's sort of reflective of what Kate was saying this morning on when she was talking about her worries as a 24-year-old. I'm not going to be able to buy a house, and I live nearby. And what's often in the local news here is that the older people aren't moving out fast enough, which is why the younger people aren't staying. And I'm like, well, there's a whole bunch of other reasons, but it really sort of interesting. Yeah. Charlotte.
Yeah, I think there is a clear difference between the micro and the macro. And I think this has come up even in the last panel. If you talk to people who are younger about how do you feel about older adults, older people, they'll be like, well, I love my parents. And I think millennials, I'm a millennial, millennials and boomers have a good relationship. We're closer than boomers were with their parents. So you're seeing this like closeness on the micro, but on the macro, there is this kind of us versus them. It's harder for us. There's less for us and a scarcity mindset that you were just talking about. And I think that is really challenging, and it is tough. Like, I'm 5 months away from paying off my student loans. I will have paid over $200,000 since graduating from college. So there is that sort of sadness of what could I have done with that money? And, my parents didn't have student loans. They're also from Europe. Different problem. But, there's these generational trends where we do feel like we're coming up from behind. And when we are close to our parents and those differences are put into stark relief, it can be really tough. And I think that's where on the macro, we get this warfare, I guess, feeling, because we're feeling like we want to do those same things. We value the same things, but it's going to take us longer.
I'm gonna let Serena comment, and then I'm gonna come back.
Hi, everyone. I think this is I was with a teacher this morning who said something about when we set up binaries, it reinforces opposition. And so I hold that also as part of this conversation and the conversations around ageism and generational warfare. In my work at the Surgeon General's office, much of my research brought me to communities across the country that were actually on the other end of the loneliness spectrum, that were very socially connected, had a lot of social cohesion. And what I often encountered was intergenerational, rich relationship, and not only that, but collaboration. And there was this recognition that the older people needed the younger people in terms of how do we forward this social change work over generations and be in this kind of power sharing and relationship building. But then on the other side of things, I've heard of numerous organizations, particularly during COVID, have huge struggles and ruptures, typically because of age and power dynamics. But at the same time, I hear of and am part of so many groups of young people asking, where are our elders in this movement and social change work? And so I think it's nuanced, but I think the under talked about and under looked at bright spots are where there is so much collaboration and care.
Yeah, I find that you don't have to push hard with individuals to say, what's your personal experience? And they will be able to say, no, this was a positive thing for me. So Charlotte, I just want to go back. What you're describing is I graduated and I had student debt and my parents didn't. And I'm 65 and I felt the same way. So, and I couldn't buy my first house because of my student debt. Now, it wasn't nearly as large as yours, but I suspect, but it really was an impediment. So I think that's an example where, all right, some of this stuff wasn't really all that different generations ago.
Right. And maybe we need to hear more of those stories as, that bright spot of you'll get through it and you'll get to those goals.
Yeah. When I say that to my 22-year-old, I'm like, yeah, mom. So Charlotte, so you started a company. I think the story of why you started Circle was really interesting. So could you tell us a little bit more about why and how and what the intended outcome was?
Yeah. So this was back in 2018 when I was 28. I started this company, Circle. It was about connecting generations of professionals. And the reason why I started it was I grew up in this household. I mentioned my parents, my mom was German, my dad was English. We moved over from France when I was young. So we were essentially immigrants with no other family close by, which made us very tight knit. But I was lucky to grow up in New York. And when I turned 18, actually, I saw my mom get laid off from her job, and she was 50 years old. It was like a double whammy when she lost actually her mom around the same time. So that is a common experience, as we've all discussed in midlife. And she really was mourning. She was crying, and she was mourning the loss of her mother, but she was also mourning the loss of her identity as someone who had worked at this company for, I think, 15 years. And when I went to college, I came right back after graduation. I lived with my parents for 4 years. And I was watching my mom and my dad, actually, they both became self-employed entrepreneurs. They were starting their own consulting businesses. And I saw them really struggle with that because they were now siloed, both working from home without, the colleague dynamic of working with people who are different from you, and sort of missing out on that link to the outside world. And at the same time, I was in my first job. I was working at Vice, the media company, working alongside other 20 somethings. And so we were both in these age silos, very much age segregated. And as much as my parents were fulfilling that role of a traditional mentor figure to me as I was navigating that strange new world of the office, and all the politicking and the strangeness that comes with that for the first time, I was actually a mentor to them because they were figuring out, this was 2013, so social media was kind of new. And my mom works in the art world, and I was working in this very creative space, getting access to what was going on in the art world from a more grassroots perspective. And so we had this natural exchange. And I would hear my 22-year-old coworkers at Vice be like, "Oh, I really wish I had a mentor. Like, where do I get me one of those?" And my parents' friends were also sort of like, "I wish I had, a more age diverse network, or friends who were younger. I want to know what's going on outside of my bubble." So I figured there's a need for that channel to connect, generations of professionals, but it didn't exist. And it certainly didn't exist in a cool way. Maybe there was something at work, but again, I worked alongside 20 somethings and 30 somethings, so not quite the same thing. And so I created Circle, and it was a membership style community. Many members are here, which is so nice to see you guys in person. And we matched people across generations every month. So it was sort of like mentorship meets networking, and there was no mentor-mentee hierarchy. Everyone was a member of this community. Everyone was there to learn as much to share and teach. And so, yeah, that was a special 5 years.
So quickly, now that you've transitioned back into a more traditional environment, what does your experience feel like now?
Yeah, I'm putting some of this into practice. I've seen some bad and some good in terms of, the multi-generational workforce. I'd say I'll start, I guess, with the bad. So I worked in venture capital for 3 years at 2 different funds. And I definitely saw sort of the founder syndrome, when someone basically, not in all cases, but oftentimes the founder of a business is someone who doesn't want to work for other people. And so they can tend to surround themselves with yeah-sayers, or, yes men, where they don't really want to be challenged. And so I sort of felt in some of those environments that I didn't have a safe space to say, I don't agree, or didn't have a forum to share my ideas really. The good example to counter that is recently, I work at Cooley, which is a law firm, and we just hired a 60-year-old business development executive. And, we had a one-on-one. And I thought it was really cool because when in that one-on-one, he really created space for us to see each other. And he told me how he got hired, which was my experience was 6 months of grueling interviews, very intense. And he looked at me and he's like, "Yeah, so they recruited me. They picked me. I was already in the ecosystem." And he wanted to tell me about all of his experience, but he left that space for me to share all the things that I had accomplished too. So I felt like we were able to really see each other and start to build that appreciation for how we would work together.
That's kind of cool. So Chris, I think the idea of the house as whether as an asset or whether as a co-housing situation, either as a catalyzer for better generational connections or not, I think is interesting. I did want to I have a statistic that we often cite. Pew Research has been looking at multi-generational housing for decades. And the US population who is currently living in multi-generational housing has quadrupled since 1971. And it was not what I think a lot of people think catalyzed by COVID. It's a trend that's been happening for a long time. And the satisfaction of those living in multi-generational households, am I happy with it? Am I doing it on purpose? Do I want to leave as soon as I can? No, the vast majority of people surveyed said they're very content with their multi-generational living arrangements.
Absolutely. And you're right. I think that the home is is at the front line of this generational discussion, because that's where obviously families are raised, friends meet, social events happen. But I think as I think about what's happened over the last 10 years, and you mentioned COVID, the disruption of both just the pandemic itself and then the inflation that followed it, I'd say there's been several key differences that have been very influential on this generational conversation. So the first is the rise of remote work, right? So there are now millions of Americans today who are working out of the home that weren't 10 years ago. Now, there's a bit of reversion to the mean happening right now. You heard JP Morgan Chase about 2 weeks ago said, nope, you're coming back to the office whether you like it or not. New administration just came in. You're coming back to the office whether you like it or not. So clearly that's happening, but there still is going to persist, regardless of where it goes. There will be millions of more Americans, and I happen to be one of them. I was in an office 5 days a week, and my wife and I now work from home. And it's interesting because that obviously shrinks your universe a little bit, right? There are days and weeks where you'll travel less than 5 miles from your house. You'll spend more time. You'll see your kids more. You may see your parents more, your in-laws more. And you're right. I think there's both pluses and minuses to that. But I think bringing families together and spending time, and that time driving communication, understanding of each other's challenges and benefits is definitely a good thing. The other thing that we've seen is, as you said, the multi-generational households have gone up. Our stats, you mentioned quadrupled in the 70s. We've seen it go up literally 50% in the last 6 years, and the pandemic was an accelerator of that. And that could be kids moving back to the house after college, just because, again, affordability. So they have a job, but they can't afford a home, so they're moving back in with mom and dad, or the adult taking on their aging parents. And again, overwhelmingly positive, right? There's obviously a mental health benefit to both parties. There's also a financial benefit. It kind of depends on who you ask, which side of that relationship you ask, but obviously there's a lot of benefits there. There's obviously a significant increase in desire to age in place, and that's been talked about on, I think, every single panel. And the concept of aging in place is, I want to continue to live in the home, my home, in my neighborhood, until I pass away. And 85 to 90% of people pre-pandemic would say, clearly I want to. Now, after the pandemic, it's literally everybody. I mean, managed care and the idea of going to a nursing home had a bit of a reputational crisis. Post-pandemic, that was only heightened. But I think now people are understanding, with the equity they have in their home, they now have an asset, the source that can be turned into cash to make this possible. I can make renovations to my home. I can actually pay for managed care, these hundreds of thousands of dollars that I've accumulated that wasn't even there 5 years ago, as now an enabler. So what we find very interesting in our business is telling people, you don't believe you have the ability to do this, you actually do. And it's a very, very exciting thing. And then the last piece is the idea of home as a retirement asset. It's no secret, especially in areas like this, that homes have appreciated over the last 10 years. They're actually up about 72 to 75% on a median. So median home in 2012 was about $240,000. Median home today is about $420,000. And so you think about that accumulation of equity and what you can do with it, and the ability to use that asset as a retirement asset. And for us, we see something like 80% of people over 60, the overwhelming majority of their net worth is tied up in their home. And so what we talk about is using it in ways to support, if you have undersaved and you don't have liquid net worth, you can tap that asset really to support your life, support your kids, support your aging parents, and really be a benefactor of multi-generational interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything I read the hyperbole is, kids are being forced to move back into their family homes because they have too much student debt. And actually the statistics say, no, it is actually a fulfilling move for a number of reasons. Kids can pay off some of their debt. They reduce their financial costs. And in many cases, they don't want to move out. So, Serena, I'm reflecting on some things that Emmy said, and I know if Laura was still here, but just putting multiple generations into a physical space for the sake of putting them co-locating them doesn't really work. Yeah, Emmy said you don't put, just because you put the preschool next to the senior center isn't going to work. Your work is about bringing generations together on social movements. So what brought you to this? And tell us a little bit more about what you're doing.
I think what brought me into this intergenerational impulse, which I look back on my adult life and realize that's been this thread and through line. And whenever I stop to think about it, I realize like, oh, it's because I miss my grandparents. And oh, it's because I miss that village impulse that I think so many of our lineages come from, but isn't how I was born and raised in the States. And so that through line, I think, guided me into the Surgeon General's office, working on loneliness and social isolation, but always having this inclination towards and why aren't we talking more about intergenerational relationship, but relationship not just for the sake of that, for the sake of being able to participate as change makers in so many of our social issues today. And I guess from being part of various intergenerational, often multi-faith spaces, it became quite evident to me that, oh my goodness, and just looking at the news and just being a human right now, it's like there are so many issues, and this time is both so novel and so new, yet there are so many patterns of the past and of history that we are living in. And I often am with my friends and other young people wondering, where do we source that wisdom and that understanding of how do we place ourselves in this moment and respond to these crises, but with the understanding and the lessons learned from all that has come before. And so that really was this impulse around wanting to study and see what are the ways, especially in our social movements, where this kind of intergenerational collaboration is happening. And I think one thing I've noticed is that in movement spaces, not uniquely, but in particular, they're youth-led and there's so much energy and fire and that is so needed. And at the same time, there is so much cancel culture and so much burnout and so much conflict. And I loved, Laura, what Laura said about cohorts. And I think part of the late teens to mid 20-something-year-old cohort is this inability or the need to grow our muscles around conflict. And when I think about not necessarily age-wise, but by notion of being able to hold the wholeness of each person like an elder archetype, it really feels like those kinds of relationships and that way of being is so needed in our movement spaces. And how do we infuse that both in practice, but also in narrative as well? And so that's really what has been guiding this work of trying to lift up the stories and examples of intergenerational councils and collectives and relationships that are able to promote a more whole way of being in this kind of work.
What are some of the things you're doing to sort of catalyze those connections and those, what are the practices that you are putting in place?
Well, it's been interesting. I'm only just at the beginning of this research, but already I've found numbers of for example, there's this organization called the National Council of Elders, and they're this group of about 30-something civil rights movement elders who are continuing to raise their hands and say, we're available, young people, tap on us if you have a question or a conflict or something you want to think about or a direct action for us to show up and provide sort of that symbolic representation of who we are to this. Or I've seen councils of grandmothers who invite in young people who are working through conflict as well to be witnessed by them, and to also invite in other aspects of conflict process, such as around culture and ceremony and ritual. But there's so many, I think, different small local ways in which this is happening, and trying to find ways to, yeah, really promote and tell the stories.
I think as I hear all of you talk, and given the work that we do at the center, this is a case where we can point to examples. We've had other panelists over the last day or two talk about activities they're doing to bring together generations in a positive way. And I'm trying to figure out why we haven't sort of lifted all of these examples up in a more specific way, which says this myth about generational warfare, or generational warfare is a myth, though I do think there are some legitimate conflicts. But I'm going to end this before I open it up to the audience by saying, within the workforce, I'm going to give a hat tip to a colleague that we've worked with for a long time who just recently left Mercer, Hagnell Banchin, who actually had millions of employee records, and he was actually able to do the analysis about our older generations staying in the workforce really taking jobs away from the younger workforce. And at a macro level, the answer is no. And we already know that. There were cases that within individual company silos that may have been the case. So I'm not a believer in workplace generational warfare either. No.
There was one thing I wanted to add that's like a new interest space for me. And if anyone is like interested in discussing this, I'm around for a drink later. But I'm really curious to learn more and explore this transfer of small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, there's, millions of small businesses in the US. They're run by people from, 50 plus. I'm actually working with a woman in her 80s, and she's got a great small business, and her kids don't want to be the successors. And so there's this really cool opportunity of matchmaking between business owners. And instead of maybe even going to one of these great business schools like GSB, if you don't make it there, you could learn by doing and actually take over a small business. And so I love that opportunity, and I'm trying to work with this woman as a broker. And so we'll see how that goes.
On the topic of matchmaking, the only thing I'd say is there's actually, in the context of multi-generational homes, there's actually business and market opportunities opening up. So at Finance of America, we used to own a business called Silvernest, and Silvernest was basically a home sharing platform designed specifically for people over 50. So you could help people if they had a home and they had a room and they were looking for a roommate, we'd help them find a roommate. But what we found is in some cases, it was actually multi-generational. So it was a married couple who had a home, they were empty nesters, and people that they would get matched with would be people in their potentially 20s who, there was actually an individual, my cousin actually took advantage of this here in the Bay Area, lived with an older couple in their 60s. It was enormously beneficial for him because he couldn't afford housing, beneficial for the couple, and it worked out. And it was a period of 9 to 12 months. And yes, there was an economic exchange there in the business, and it was matching. But at the same time, those types of things are sprouting up. And before, where you'd expect people just in their 20s right out of college to do that, you're now seeing that happen on a multi-generational scale as well.
If I could just jump in and plug that, Co-Generate is doing exactly that, of trying to lift up the stories and best practices and strategies. And one of the beautiful reports that was released last year was around looking at doing a qualitative study around young leaders who are collaborating intergenerationally, and what are the best practices and lessons that can be learned and shared with older allies as well. And I know there's a whole series of work coming from that ethos of we need generational collaboration, and here's how.
And here are great examples of why. So we have a couple of minutes left. Camille, you've been raising your hand for a while.
Thanks. I just think it's interesting, the discussion, because what's happening in the UK certainly is that the baby boomers own 80% of the wealth, put at $7 trillion. And what you have is a very unequal society where a post-war welfare state designed to help people with pensions, education, and savings is now a situation where the young people are having to finance themselves with and their education, paying fees. We didn't have that before. And they also have to finance the cost of the healthcare of the baby boomers. So you have this very unequal society where, with the advent of divorce, for example, the state has to take up the cost of mothers and children, for example, which was never designed to do that. So inherent in the whole structure are major structural problems with the distribution of wealth. So young people are now, there's a covenant which each generation would look after the next. But that covenant has been broken because the baby boomers are so wealthy, foreign holidays, second homes, pensions, and the people starting out don't have any of that. And they have to finance themselves now. So I don't know how it is in the US, but I'm just flagging that as an issue, which creates what has been described as a housing problem and so on. It's actually a major structural economic redistribution required for people to be able to afford to live in that society now. And that's causing a lot of tension.
Some of those structural issues, many of the same structural issues exist in the US. I am going to mention an organization that we were introduced to, SCL was introduced to, about a year and a half ago, called freethefacts.org. Free the Facts is trying to engage younger people in the political process, not as voters, but as future policymakers, future politicians. And at the center of their purpose is trying to get younger people engaged on the future of Social Security and Medicare. And it's totally nonpartisan. The way it's funded is really interesting. They're really just trying to, by education and engagement, grab college students and say, these are the facts. Now, how you choose to solve it, you can do any number of things, but and it's really funny. I think they're now on well over 100 college campuses, and have already put 5,000 kids in DC internships, and they really said, we've got some major structural issues, and that are gonna impact younger people more than older people. Let's get them engaged in the process. So, Johan.
Yes, we have one question online. Following up on Laura's initial words on cohort differences, that a lot of them are entrenched in values. An online participant was wondering if you can recall an experience in which you were surprised to hear that you share values with someone of a different cohort.
I can.
Yes. To me, I was going to say, I don't know. I'm struggling with a specific, but it just happens. I guess my point is, it happens all the time, and I think we shouldn't undersell those. I truly believe that yes, there is difference in the time and now, and the different factors that we all face. But overwhelmingly, I think you'd be surprised at the values and aspirations for a given cohort at a certain age. Like, what were baby boomers thinking about when they were in their 20s and their 30s? And Martha, you said it, right? We often assume they didn't face the same things, but oftentimes student debt, thinking about the future, buying a house, starting a family, the risks associated with job or losing a job, like those are human problems that I think sometimes we assign to certain cohorts. And I oftentimes think if we just stop to think or put ourselves, and I had a gentleman who was on the last panel, Bill, it was a beautiful comment, this idea that aging is the one thing we all experience. Right. And it's so true. It's right, versus, race or nationality, which is unique to those individuals. This is something with luck, we will all experience. And I think if we just remember and let some of the stereotype and the soundbite go away, you're going to find a lot more similarity than difference, in my opinion.
Yeah, we had a circle event at Ashton's house in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and it was so much fun. It felt like a party that I would have with my, best friends from high school. Like, I think there's a lot of examples in this room of people who like to do the same things and value the same things.
Just a funny experience I find myself having is often being able to relate to my elders who are in their 60s and 70s more than folks in their 40s. And I sometimes stop to wonder, like, why is that? I haven't found an answer yet.
Well, I think there's a life stage moment. So I'm a young boomer who had my only child when I was 44. I went back to work and I had more in common with my employees who were in their late 20s who had just given birth to young children. And we would actually sit over lunches going, all right, what are you thinking of childcare? What are you going to do? Have you already signed up for preschool? And, you know, these kids were 20 some odd years younger than me. So.
Hi, maybe a question or a comment. I thank you to everybody for your wonderful insights. I'm really interested in this idea of how to support small businesses and their continuation. I think I'm from New York City too, and growing up, I remember all the independent donut shops were run by Greek immigrants, and then their children became socially and upwardly mobile, didn't want to do that, and that's why I love California donuts now. I still find a lot of family businesses, independent businesses. So shout out to those pink boxes and all of the family businesses that are continuing to make good donuts for me here on the West Coast. But I love this idea, and I'm sure it's on your radar, but I'm just thinking this is a wonderful opportunity to not only partner across different age groups, but also tapping into immigrants' track record of higher rates of entrepreneurship and starting small businesses. And I really like this idea. And so thank you for putting that on the radar.
We have time for one quick question. Okay.
Come, Simon. So on the topic of small business, last year I was at the Century Summit, and afterwards I did a workshop for an organization called TeamShare. You can look it up and give you the information. They actually basically provide capital to help people who are transitioning out of their small business, and they basically allow people to buy into it, and they create an opportunity for employees to actually become employee-owned businesses. They parachute people in who want to be CEOs, right? And they source them. What was most interesting related to longevity and the transition out is the people who are leaving these businesses, they put their hearts and soul into these businesses. And so very much like the people who go to DCI and all these other transition programs, they are not sure how to do what's next. And so one of my friends actually runs a program called the Former Owners Program as part of TeamShare. And as a cohort, they explore what's next, et cetera, and they help them transition out to the next thing. So there's actually a model out there. And I'm from Canada. There's another company called Regenerative Capital in Canada that does very much the same thing. So I think it's a very new, but a segment that's going to grow.
So with that, thank you. This was great. And thank you, everybody in the audience. And I'm going to hand it over to Ken.